History can do without one man. Who am I that I can't just kind of throw away my life on this quest to write one perfect sentence? Once you can face your mortality, you realize, I really have nothing to lose. So why don't I do the one thing I dream of doing? And that is creating something that transcends not just my experience, but really connects with a lot of people.
I remember looking up from the book and looking around and almost feeling like, I hope no one knows what I'm reading or thinking right now.
There are a lot of accounts of people who've been reading that particular story, and they fainted on subway platforms, or they fainted sitting in public transport. I am always trying to recreate the kind of strength that stories had when I was a child, stories that you would hear around a campfire, stories that would sort of completely terrify you and overwhelm you. And so anytime a short story can have any kind of a strong effect like that, whether it's people passing out or people weeping, I love to see 20-something people start to cry, especially if they're young men. That's the kind of huge effect that I think stories can have, and completely reaffirms my choice to be a writer.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is...
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Chuck Palahniuk, the American best-selling novelist and journalist, best known for writing Fight Club and Choke. Over the past 24 years, you published 23 best-selling books, including 17 novels, a collection of essays, a travel guide, 2 coloring books, and a personal memoir. Your 1996 book, Fight Club, was adapted into the Hollywood blockbuster movie starring Brad Pitt and Edward Norton, which the New York Times called the defining cult movie of our time. In 2005, during a live reading of your horror story Guts, 67 people fainted due to graphic content, and today you continue to push the boundaries of storytelling. Your latest book, The Invention of Sound, is the chilling tale of a father searching for his missing daughter and has been described as, quote, your most suspenseful, daring, and genre-defining work yet. Chuck, welcome to London Real.
Hey, thank you very much. Wow. Just to correct, it wasn't 60. I've never had 63 people faint at one event. The most I've ever had is 8 people. And that was in Brighton, England, at the Brighton Fringe Festival.
Do English people faint more often than Americans?
No, it was just that it was such a vast crowd. It might have been 1,800 people in this Corn Exchange Hall, this big Victorian sort of huge cavernous building.
And was that... while we're on this, was that a win for you? I mean, is that always something that you like to see, or is that something you'll always remember, or was it just something that surprised you?
I am always trying to recreate the kind of strength that stories had when I was a child, stories that you would hear around a campfire, stories that would sort of completely terrify you and overwhelm you. And so anytime a short story can have any kind of a strong effect like that, whether it's people passing out or people weeping, I love to see 20-something people who have it so together. I love to see them start to cry, especially if they're young men. That's the kind of huge effect that I think stories can have, and completely reaffirms my choice to be a writer.
And do you think if they were reading the same story as opposed to being in a room where you're reciting it, would they have the same reaction, or is there something different with that group energy and the voice tonality or vibrations?
There are a lot of accounts of people who've been reading that particular story, and they fainted on subway platforms, or they fainted sitting in public transport. So I even saw a man standing in line at a book event waiting to get a book signed, and he was reading the story, and he fainted standing there in line. So the story seems to hold up. But for other stories, in particular, the one that tends to make people weep, I think delivery is a large part of that one.
Yeah, I honestly recall moments in my life over the past 24 years where I was reading one of your books, and I remember looking up from the book and looking around and almost feeling like, I hope no one knows what I'm reading or thinking right now. Almost like I had to look over my shoulder, as if someone was reading my mind, or even knowing what you were saying, that I might be shamed somehow.
And that's kind of the wonderful bonus of a book, is that you go into it all by yourself, and you're the only person experiencing it. And I think that's why a book can go to places that movies just can't. Movies and television and music. Well, music can be consumed alone, but everything else risks being consumed by a very large group. Yeah, books have that privacy.
And I guess when you're reading it, you can take yourself to places in your mind. Well, maybe your subconscious can know to take you places you normally wouldn't go. And those can be more terrifying than any CGI graphic Hollywood could ever create.
And also, through the abstraction of language, you can actually depict things that would overwhelm the audience if they were to see them literally made and depicted in a film, that the audience would have to walk away or shut down, leave the narrative. But language gives you so much abstraction that you can depict these things and get away with it without completely shutting down the audience.
And I've heard that you're really intentional about your language to make sure that the reader can first of all, you can convey certain emotions, but also so they don't necessarily formulate things in their mind. I think you said you don't use abstractions?
That's one of the main tenets of the style of minimalism that I was taught, is that abstractions and pejorative language, things like that, are all shortcuts, and they cheat the reader out of a more powerful experience. That, when you have a character describe another character as being 6 foot tall, then you've lost the opportunity to describe the point of view character's life and experience, and how for them another character of that size would occur. Because we never really see things in terms of, a 100-degree day, a 6 foot tall man driving 35 miles an hour. The point is to use all of those descriptive opportunities as a way of describing the point of view character's perception of the world.
And I think you've also said, if I was telling you a story, I wouldn't say, Chuck, I met this guy and he was 6 foot tall and it was 100 degrees out. I would have been like, this guy was massive and it was sweltering and I was going super fast. I mean, we wouldn't talk to each other if we were telling that story that way.
Exactly. You would particularize the language, and you would burn the language, what we call, you would misstate things, but you would misstate things in a way where the language was just your own, and it was a language that was really unique just to that story. And so the toughest part of my job is to reinvent storytelling as appropriate for every single story, whether it's a novel or a short story.
That's tricky to do.
It's exhausting. And with so much of my work is about listening to people and listening to how they burn the language, how they sort of warp and reinvent the language when they tell a story. And with the lockdown, that's become almost impossible.
Where would you go to listen to that? And would you do it on the sly, or was it just conversations with people you knew?
A lot of times it would be in groups. It would be at parties, because at parties, you're looking for people who throw out a topic, and then you're looking to see how readily people engage with the topic. At the workshop that I was running with students just before the lockdown, we were talking about a magazine store, a used bookstore that had recently closed. And someone in the group said that people who were selling their used copies, their collections of Playboy, would no longer have a place to sell them. And then somebody else said, I wonder if that's how the big box of porn in the woods happens. And everyone at the table, students from the age of 18 to 65, 70, all leaned forward and they all had a story about finding a box of porn or a duffel bag or a garbage bag of porn in the woods or in the desert or on the beach or stuffed up a tree. And they all found these things as children. And none of them had ever talked about the experience. And so finding that experience that resonates with everyone, but that no one has really openly discussed, is a big part of listening. And then listening to the language with which they finally talk about it. It's so powerful to discover that thing that everyone holds in common, but everyone thinks that they're alone in their experience of.
It's interesting how you create, Chuck, because I always assumed, and maybe this is true of a typical novelist, is they're like, I'm going to make this masterpiece and I'm going to drop it on the world and they're going to be in awe at what I created. But you seem to, I'm testing my stuff in the world. In fact, I'm mirroring the world to a certain extent and finding these things that people never knew existed. And then I'm putting my construct on it and then I'm putting it back out. But you must already be somewhat confident that there's something resonating there because, like I said, you've almost pre-road tested it.
Exactly. You've taken it to so many people and you have tested whether or not they engage with it, whether or not they have a similar experience. And then they help develop the idea, because if they have experienced something like that, then they can sort of flesh out the theme with another example, probably a better example of what I brought to them. And they can also tell me if the theme or the idea has been explored in popular culture in recent history, because you just don't want to be treading well-trod ground. And so taking it to people and sort of field testing it does that. That tests whether people engage. It develops the idea with those people's experience, and it tests whether or not the thing is worth pursuing if it's already been sort of explored already in the culture.
So parties kind of used to be your research and development lab in a way, but now that's harder to do, or it's impossible to do, because you could have those same people on a Zoom call and they might say nothing if you bring up the box of porn on a Zoom call, whereas in a group environment, you could see the cues and then it would start.
Exactly. And the other most important aspect of testing it is that, especially when I teach, the most important feedback people can get to their work is when they read it aloud and they listen to the emotional reaction, that kind of unintellectualized gasp or laugh, or that fantastic silence that indicates tension. Because after that, what they get is intellectualized academic feedback, which is almost entirely useless. What you want to hear is how the story works in front of an audience, where it lags, where it gets boring, to discover where the laughs are, where you didn't realize there was a laugh there. You need an extra time, an extra beat to allow that laugh to build, where you might be able to add a laugh after that. And so reading it and testing it in front of an audience just for their unfiltered emotional reaction is the most important aspect of that process. And on services like Zoom, it doesn't work because only one person at a time can make a noise.
It sounds more like stand-up comedy, Chuck, than what I would assume the writing process is like.
It's very similar to how you would open a show out of town, and you would run this play or musical through a lot of different smaller markets and really get the kinks out of it before you would eventually take it to a big market, open it in New York.
Do you think a lot of writers read their work to other people and get those reactions? Or is it usually like, read this, and then tell me what you think afterwards.
That read it and tell me what you think afterwards, I hold very little, respect for that. Because what you get is the sort of obligated, intellectualized fixing of the work. And there's a lot of politics involved in that. And there's a lot of kind of showing off involved in that. So that is, almost more detrimental than it is beneficial. What I want is to be able to read it and to test the clarity. The only question I really have afterwards is, did you understand everything that took place in this story? Because clarity is the most important quality of a story in my mind.
Interesting. I guess that's interesting. Do you ever want someone to have to read something 10 times before they really understand it? Or do they read it 10 times to see it in 10 different ways at 10 different times in their life?
The latter. Because the first time they're going to read it, they're going to get the horizontal of it. They're going to get the physical plot of what happens and how it ends. And subsequent readings at different points in their life, when they're at different emotional places, they will read it and they will get different messages from it. So, yeah, a bunch of readings, but across a long period of time.
But you want clarity on that first reading, no matter what.
Exactly. Oh my, it took me forever as a child to learn to read. And I was always so self-conscious about not being able to read until, all of my classmates could read, that I just don't want to make the reader feel stupid. I never want to confuse the reader or make the reader feel like they're not understanding what's taking place. So physical verbs, a lot of clarity, a certain amount of repetition, and things paced in such a way that the reader is actually kind of ahead of the narrator, and the reader will come to realize what's taking place before the narrator realizes the true nature of what's happening. And when the reader feels smarter than the narrator, then you completely have the reader under your control. The reader feels sympathetic to the point of view character, and the reader feels so joyous that they're actually sort of ahead of the game. And that's when you hit them with the big, big plot event.
And you use this technique in all of your works or your fiction works?
I try to. It is what I aspire to do. But, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Everything is an experiment.
I just had a weird thought, and tell me if I'm way off here. I'm wondering if that's why people like watching YouTubers and reality TV, because we can all see how someone's going into a train wreck. They can't, almost by definition, because that's what life is. And we get to see it in real time. And then something ultimately happens. And then, like you said, we have that feeling of, I always knew that was going to happen. Do I have anything there or not?
What is the first thing that Scarlett O'Hara says in Gone with the Wind?
It's that war line, right?
War, war, war. There is not going to be any war. And the moment she says that, the reader thinks, oh, you poor, beautiful, charming, wealthy idiot. And regardless of all of her gifts, we are smarter than her, and we know that she's about to go through something really miserable. And so we care about her, and we feel superior to her. And that's not a bad place to put the reader.
Does the same thing happen in Taxi Driver, where you're kind of going along the narrative with Travis, and as I remember, about 30, 40 minutes in, he kind of goes off the reservation to where you're like, okay, now this guy's taking it even further than I thought he was going to take it. And then does something similar happen in that storyline, or is that a different technique there?
I always talk about how do you create authority? And I always see that as one form of creating authority is to dare to go to a place that the reader didn't anticipate, or that the reader didn't think that anyone would have the nerve to go to. I'm thinking of in Jesus' Son, there's a short story called Dirty Wedding. That's a story collection by Dennis Johnson. And in the story, Dirty Wedding, the main character, who's known as Fuckhead, takes his girlfriend to an abortion clinic. And he's waiting while she's having the procedure. And a nurse comes out and says, Michelle is at peace now. And the point of view character says, is she dead? And the nurse becomes very flustered and says, no, of course she's not dead. Why would you even ask that? And Fuckhead says, because I kind of wish she was. And that moment is so brutal, but it establishes Dennis Johnson's authority that he is going to do things in this story that completely surprise us and that are completely brutally honest, but also really ugly. And after that, we read him with this kind of trepidation, but also this respect. It's as if he's kind of reached out and slapped us. We have kind of a new sort of wariness, but we're also so much more engaged.
Yeah, I think that kind of happens to Taxi Driver a little bit too, when he starts shaving his head and burning his arm over the stove, and you're like, okay, he's taking it to another level. Now, I was with him, now I'm watching him do something, but I can't stop watching him as well.
And then ultimately when it leads to that huge bloodbath in the hallways, that doesn't come out of left field anymore, because we've now been kind of primed that anything can happen at this point.
Yeah, but the funny part is when he takes his date to the porn movie in the beginning, you can kind of forgive him. You're like, he didn't know any better. He probably, la. So it's like you're still trying to stay with him as he starts going further and further away. But then at some point he goes so far to where now you're spectating as opposed to maybe accompanying him. I don't know.
It's interesting when you sort of compare that scene to the scene where Dustin Hoffman takes Catherine Ross to the porn movie in The Graduate in order to really offend her and hurt her. It's just interesting how you see the same thing happen. One is played for comedy and one is played for drama.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I read somewhere, I heard you on an interview talk about how when you look at your work many years later, you'll read it and realize that your subconscious was actually playing a narrative out in your head or doing something that maybe your conscious mind didn't know it was doing at the time. And that really sat with me over the past couple of days when I was preparing for this. And I had a reflection on what I've been doing here for the past 9 years. And I'll just give you a quick update. I mean, before I started having these conversations with people, I was kind of a Wall Street banker in London, and I was really miserable. And I was trying to do everything I thought was the right thing to do, which was make as much money as possible. And I was slowly drinking myself to death. And at one point, I just stopped and I started having these conversations, Chuck, and it made no sense. It made no money. But when I look back at the 9 years, I think it was forcing me to do everything I hadn't done in my life, which is forced me to be around strangers. It forced me to put myself on camera. I'm a natural introvert. And it forced me to get uncomfortable in ways that my constructed life kept me away from, but it was also making me miserable. And now when I look back, it was the exact antidote I needed. In a way, I hate to make this analogy, but it was almost like my Fight Club, where I had to push myself into these structured, uncomfortable situations to do what I had almost conditioned myself not to do because of this societal norm that says when you make the money and you got to this, you'll be successful. So I don't know, I'm curious what you think of that, and how do you look at your work in retrospect? Do you see parts of your character that was crying for help or, pulling you in certain directions?
The workshop where I learned minimalism was led by a man named Tom Spanbauer. And Tom's sort of program of teaching, he called dangerous writing. And he said the point is to write about something that you don't really fully remember and you don't really fully understand, but it troubles you. And it's something you can't resolve in your life. So that in writing about it, you can explore it through a metaphor. And that way, even if it never sells, then at least you have the kind of benefit of the therapy of having cathartically looked at every aspect of this issue, again, through a metaphor. You've exaggerated it, you've blown it up out of proportion, you've turned it into a gigantic monster, and at least on the page you've resolved it, and you've really exhausted your emotional reaction to it. And so typically, by the time you're done with the story or the book, your reaction is gone, and that issue is gone. It is so amazing. It's so much like magic that by the time you're writing about the story, the real issue has vanished from your life. You come out of writing and the thing is gone entirely. It's just fantastic. So even if you didn't find an editor, an agent, a publisher, you would keep doing this dangerous writing.
Do you need that mentor, though, to keep pushing you to go into the darkness? And you have to show up and prove your work and have the workshop people come back to you and say, come on, Chuck, this is BS. You're not actually going where you need to go.
Well, workshop helps. Oh my gosh. To get that reaction every week and to get just the task validated. Tom always used to say that 99% of what any workshop does is just give you license, validate the task of writing, because otherwise you're just a person terrified that you're wasting your time. And in workshop, you're able to discuss these issues, but in a craft way. It's not, what am I doing with my life? It's what is the character doing? And what if the character took this action? And isn't the character aware of this thing or this element? And what about if this other element came in? So you're talking about it in this kind of hands-off, detached way. And that's really kind of the only way you can talk about these things that are so frightening to you, so kind of submerged in your subconscious.
Interesting. I think therapists do that with kids, where they'll have like a doll or a stuffed animal, and they'll ask them how the stuffed animal feels, and they can tell them how the stuffed animal feels, but they don't tell them how they feel. I don't know. It just kind of came to my mind,
There's a writer, Steve Allman, and he teaches writing workshops around the country. And he's made the observation that talk therapy, was very popular and very effective, but it was also very expensive. And so it was more or less replaced by pharmaceuticals. And now people are coming back to talk therapy, but they're doing it in the form of writing workshops where it's very cheap. Sometimes it's free. And you get to have the benefit of kind of a rap group or a therapy group, but you're all doing it under the guise of writing a fiction.
That's fascinating. And you have to do the work. You can't just show up and talk. You kind of have to go back and create something and go deeper. But there's a little more accountability there, maybe.
And also you have to do it in such a way that it's engaging. You can't just go and kind of vomit like you would with a therapist. It has to be, something that engages, that's clear, that other people can relate to.
Yeah, I never realized that workshops could do that much. I just assumed it was a way to write things, but I guess it's much more than that. There's another observation I had when I was looking through the past 9 years, and every now and then we have a guest on my show that, I don't know, resonates with me, and we go make a documentary film with them. We hang out with them for weeks or months, and we tell a story around them. And I've got posters on our wall of 6 of them. And when I look at them, Chuck, they're all these alpha males. That's what they are. People come by and they're like, why are they all men? Why are they all these alphas? As a Navy SEAL or a punk rocker or a high performance coach or a bodybuilder? And I'm like, I don't know. But when I look back at my 9 years, I feel like I've been searching for that male role model I never had. Maybe that's a father figure. And now when I look at the people watching us, I feel like to a certain extent, that's a lot of what's happening too. And it's mostly males, but still females too. And funny enough, Chuck, it's those strong archetypal male figures that get the most views, even though sometimes they're politically incorrect. But it's almost like this thing I feel like maybe I'm searching for, or maybe the world is searching for to a certain extent. I know you explore that in some of your works, but just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, Joseph Campbell did a lot of work around what he called the secondary father, that men and women have a primary father, a biological father. And that father can take them to a certain point in their life, but that father cannot be kind of the master to their apprenticeship. That father can't be as kind of brutally strict as the secondary father can. And the secondary father typically was a teacher or a drill instructor or a coach or sometimes someone in the clergy, but someone who could, or a master. In my case, you could argue my secondary father was Tom Spanbauer. And I went into Tom's workshop and I thought I could write, and I couldn't write. I couldn't write shit. I was writing really bad Stephen King ripoff garbage. And Tom said, no abstracts, no pejorative language. Tom gave me 1,000 rules, and he made me write according to these rules. And so in a way, you're describing secondary fathers, people who have achieved a kind of mastery in a field, and they can be the really hard-ass, badass sort of coach that people need beyond the primary father, beyond the biological father. And I think it's a kind of model of master and apprentice that we've forgotten about. And so we have a lot of sort of apprentices looking around for who does what they themselves would like to do.
And why can't the primary father, be in that role? Is it because ultimately they love the child too much to be strong and rigid? Or is it that the child will never actually listen to the father because because they know that ultimately they love them, so they know they won't push him as hard as someone that could walk away? I don't know. It's a complicated question.
I think it's a little of all of those. The biological father can't risk losing the affection of the child, and may not have the skill set that the child really needs. So it's kind of a crapshoot whether the father could even teach what the child needs taught. Especially in a culture where people aspire to something better than their parents or different than their parents, they need to find a secondary father who's not just an extension of the biological father.
Yeah, it's true. Again, and I'm looking at the wall of my secondary fathers, and they all bring something unique to the table. One is a physical, one is a psychedelic master, one is a high performance, one is a Navy SEAL. They all bring all these different parts that I guess one man could never bring anyways. And maybe back in the days of the clan and the village, I would have exposure to these different men. But, in this modern era, I guess you kind of have to search them out.
In a way, too, the secondary father also connects the apprentice with the larger world. That when I finally wrote a publishable manuscript, it was Tom Spanbauer, my teacher, who said, you need to submit it to Tom's agent. And so that's how I got my agent, and the agent connected me with publishers. And so the secondary father has connections in the world that the primary father is not likely to have.
Right. It's interesting. I just had children. I've got a 3 and a 4-year-old son, and I'm looking at them, and I mean, it's hard to imagine. I love them so much. I've never ever felt love like this. And so I don't know if I'll be able to be the disciplinarian I need to be. And funny enough, one of my mentors says this. He says, I don't want my kids to love me. He said, 25 years after I'm dead, I want them to respect me. Okay, now he's the hardcore of that spectrum, but that's the way he mentors, to where he tries to physically remove that bond of love so he can mentor in the best possible way. But I think it's rare for fathers to be able to do something like that. And maybe it's good they can't also.
And I would have to agree with him, because I grew up with a kind of ideal that I wanted John Houseman as my secondary father. I wanted somebody who would just be really brutal and not give me a participation trophy, who would say, not good enough, and just throw my work back at me. growing up, I grew up in a very rural community, and I really admired the Mormon families because the Mormon sons always had to call their father sir. And my family felt that that was so demeaning and so ridiculous and so antiquated that they made fun of the Mormon kids for calling their father sir and their mothers ma'am. Well, that was something that was a kind of respect that I longed for. I just dreamed of that.
I totally understand what you mean. I mean, one of the lines in Fight Club that everyone loves to quote is, we're a generation of men raised by women. And it goes on further. I'm wondering if another woman's exactly what we need. But for the first part, I mean, my parents were divorced when I was 7, and I saw my dad once every 2 weeks. A lot of us in the newer generation grew up without that father figure. Some would say a lot of the commotion that you see these days and a lot of the protests and things come from not having a father figure in the family for the past 20 or 30 years for certain communities and certain people. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't see it as much of an aberration as I think a lot of people do, because one way in which people achieve a kind of new generation of leadership is through conflict. And whether it's conflict in a military battle or a civil rights conflict, that's where our next generation of leaders emerge. And even if you don't emerge a leader like John Lewis or like Jesse Jackson, these people who came out of the civil rights movement as leaders and established their authority as leaders in a conflict. Even if you didn't come out as a leader, you still came out with a sense of being tested and having kind of exhausted an aspect of self so that later in life, you wouldn't be constantly regretting that you hadn't taken those chances and done those things when you were a younger person with fewer things to risk.
And so when you see what's happening now, and some people say this is the worst it's ever been, do you see that as just the natural cycle of humanity? And when you look back to 1968 or these other points in time, do you just say, no, this is just something that humanity actually does to itself? It's just the natural evolution of the younger generation, the older generation, new ideas?
I do. I know. I see it as just a really organic cycle of how people establish themselves in the world and how they achieve an adulthood in a world that hasn't given us a lot of really clear channels to adulthood right now. We don't really have a frontier you can go into to kind of, try to establish yourself tabula rasa. So we have to reinvent the frontier by kind of creating these war zones. So I don't see it as the big upset travesty that other people might.
And do you think we also have a tendency to forget and rewrite our own past? I think I heard you commenting recently that when you saw some of the protests in Portland, you were like, what are these kids doing? And then I think one of your friends reminded you that you used to do this too, Chuck. Do you think sometimes the older generation forgets that they once were young and either did these things or thought these things too?
Oh, one thing that kills me is my father worked for the railroad. He was a brakeman, and he would get us up in the middle of the night and put us in a pickup truck, my 2 sisters, my brother and I. And he would drive us through the desert for hours until we came across an enormous train accident, a freight train that had been derailed. And we would be there with all the other kind of subsistence families in the area. And we would loot the train. We would take whatever was being shipped in the boxcars that were busted open and all these things that were just in disarray. And I forget about that. And the other day I was kind of pissing and moaning about the looting in Chicago and the looting in Minneapolis, the looting in Portland. And a friend of mine just kind of leaned in and said, you did that. You did that as a kid, as a teenager. So you really can't say too much about people who are doing it now. So yeah, there is a big aspect of forgetting our own lives when we start to criticize other people's.
Yeah, and even forgetting how we felt when we were teenagers. Like, I can still remember when I was a teenager thinking, I can't trust anybody over 30 and probably nobody over 25. Like, they don't get it. They'll never get it. I still remember having weird thoughts like that. And I think it's hard for us to really understand how they're feeling in so many ways.
I don't think you get over that now until your late 20s and your early 30s. And at that point, you kind of realize that you're not going to have the power and the vitality of youth much longer. And you're going to need to transfer to a different form of power. And you try to do that through education. You try to do that through connections and networking. But youth is going to pass for you. And at that point, you do need to rely on other people.
I was having a conversation with someone recently, and they were in their 20s, and they were asking me lots of questions about life. And I said, honestly, I think your 20s, your late 20s, are the hardest time in your life. They were for me, because the honeymoon of being a kid is over, and yet you haven't built up the processes or even necessarily the neural structure to kind of go to that next level. And you're looking in the mirror saying, I should be further, or I should know more. And like, my late 20s were an absolute mess. I mean, I literally was a 30-year-old boy. I was in New York City quoting your line to all my friends, and I was just a total fuck up at that point. And it wasn't until I finally got away from all that life of New York City and drug addiction and watching Fight Club 100 times on replay and moved to London at 31 that I finally got to where I needed to go. But I was so hard on myself for those last few years of my 20s. I don't know, for some reason, Chuck, I thought I should have figured it out by now. And every month that went by that I didn't, I just was almost beat myself up even more. I'm curious what you think of that.
I think that's completely natural and organic. And it kind of breaks my heart when I get students who want to learn writing, and they're 18 or 19 years old. And I just tell them not to put the cart before the horse, that they have 10 years in which to kind of put together all the best stories that they're going to tell for the rest of their lives. All the poorly chosen friends, all the misadventures, all the anecdotes that they will be called upon to tell forever. When you think about Jack London, you think about Charles Darwin, their formative years were those years. And they spent the rest of their lives milking those experiences. So I always tell my younger students, yeah, it's great that you want to learn this skill, but don't neglect the messing up part of your life, because you need the messing up part of your life as the material that you will be working for the rest of your life. Once you're 31, 32, 33, then your skill set in writing and your experience in messing up will come together, and they will work together, and you'll have stuff.
Yeah, it's fascinating. About 2 years ago, one of my guests came into London Real, and his name is John Joseph. He's the lead singer of the hardcore punk band, the Cro-Mags. They were big in New York City in the 90s. And he challenged me to run an Ironman race, because after partying and smoking crack and all the stuff he did, he finally got sober, and Ironman races were his way to stay focused and clean. And so I agreed. I went to New York City and I trained with him. And when all of that physical training was happening in a place in New York where I almost ruined my life and overdosed twice, and it all came out. And while we were filming the movie, I decided to tell the story for the first time ever. And I hadn't told my wife in 16 years, and it all came out, Chuck. And honestly, I thought that the time in my life was going to be this dark black hole that would never serve any purpose. But it ended up being a massive feature of what we made a film out of. And when so many people saw it, it ended up being this incredible source of light to a lot of people. And it made for a great journey and story that actually now, I'm so glad it all happened. And it planted the seeds for what I would even do later, because once I survived that, I felt almost grateful to be alive, and I felt like I had a new chance at life. So it's funny how those really difficult times of living create all that material for later.
And also imagine if you had just stayed the good boy and you had followed the kind of path that was laid out as the blueprint for success, and you had done everything right, and kept your house clean and detailed your car, just how you would have felt by the age of 40 when all the opportunity to do that had passed you by. I think that's the tragedy, is when you reach middle age and you realize that you've been the altar boy all that time. And it's too late to be the kind of acting out bad person who has those experimental experiences.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.